Imagine a country blessed with an almost unimaginable treasure buried deep beneath its soil. Not just a little oil, but more than any other nation on earth. More than the vast deserts of Saudi Arabia, more than the sprawling fields of Russia or the shale formations of the United States. This is Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, a staggering 300 billion barrels. A figure so immense it's difficult to comprehend, a liquid fortune that promised to underwrite a century of prosperity. And for a time, that promise was dazzlingly real. This was a nation so wealthy, so confident in its future, that its capital city, Caracas, once gleamed like a tropical Miami. It was a hub of modernist architecture, avant-garde art, and international finance, a place where the middle class drove American cars, vacationed abroad, and lived a life that was the envy of the continent. This era, from the 1950s through the 70s, was Venezuela's golden age, a period fueled by a seemingly endless gusher of petrodollars. Picture a place where, for decades, the government could afford to give its citizens things that many people in wealthier countries could only dream of. It started with free education, from primary school all the way through university. The state invested heavily in creating a literate, skilled populace, believing that human capital was as important as the capital flowing from the ground. Then there was world-class healthcare, also free for all. A network of public hospitals and clinics was established, offering sophisticated treatments and attracting medical talent from across Latin America and Europe. The goal was simple and ambitious. A healthy nation is a productive nation. And it didn't stop there. The state provided generous subsidies for everyday goods. Food staples, from corn flour to cooking oil, were kept artificially cheap. And most famously, gasoline was practically free. In a country floating on oil, filling your tank cost less than a cup of coffee. This wasn't a distant fantasy or a utopian dream. This was the lived reality for millions of Venezuelans in the 20th century. The nation built monumental infrastructure projects, vast hydroelectric dams, and an extensive highway system. For a time, it stood as a beacon of prosperity and stability in a region often marked by turmoil. It was, by many measures, the most successful democracy in Latin America. This story, however, does not have a happy ending. The foundation of this prosperous society was more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. The light that burned so brightly for so long would begin to flicker, and then, catastrophically, it would go out. The very same nation that once boasted such incredible wealth now finds itself in the grips of a devastating, multifaceted crisis. The gleaming modernist towers are still there, but many stand empty or in disrepair, monuments to a bygone era. The vibrant streets have been replaced by scenes of profound hardship. The once abundant supermarket shelves are often bare. Finding basic necessities like medicine, food, and even soap has become a daily struggle for millions. The generous subsidies are a distant memory, replaced by hyperinflation so extreme that the national currency became virtually worthless, with citizens needing wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. In the face of this collapse, an unprecedented exodus has occurred. Over 7 million people have fled their homes, seeking refuge, work, and a future in neighboring countries and beyond. It is one of the largest displacement crises in the world. More than 20% of the entire population gone. Families have been torn apart, and a generation of talent has drained from the country. How could a country with such vast natural resources fall so far, so fast? How did the promise of oil, the very source of its historic wealth, turn from a blessing into a curse? The paradox is staggering. A nation with the world's largest oil reserves is unable to provide fuel for its own citizens or power for its own grid. Production has collapsed to levels not seen in nearly a century. The treasure is still there, but the ability to extract it and convert it into prosperity has vanished. The answer is not simple. There is no single cause. It is a complex story about political choices made over decades. It's about a political class that, for generations, failed to diversify the economy, leaving the nation's fate entirely dependent on the volatile price of a single commodity. When oil prices were high, the government spent lavishly. When they crashed, the country plunged into crisis. It is a story of flawed leadership, particularly the rise of a charismatic figure who promised to break with the past. A leader who tapped into legitimate public anger over inequality and corruption, offering a vision of a socialist revolution that would finally make the oil wealth serve the poor. But his policies, while well-intentioned in the eyes of his supporters, would ultimately accelerate the country's decline. And critically, it is a story about the slow, deliberate erosion of the very institutions that are meant to protect a nation from crisis and the abuse of power. The judiciary, the free press, the electoral system, and the national oil company itself, all were systematically dismantled or brought under political control, removing the checks and balances essential for a functioning democracy and a stable economy. It is about how an over-reliance on a single commodity can create a fragile prosperity, a house of cards ready to tumble at the slightest tremor. For Venezuela, those tremors came in the form of falling oil prices, political polarization, and economic mismanagement. The resulting collapse was not a sudden accident, but the inevitable outcome of a structure built on a flawed foundation. To truly understand what happened to Venezuela, we must peel back the layers of its complex history. We must go back to a time before the oil boom, examine the choices made during the golden years, and analyze how a populist leader harnessed public anger to seize power, promising a revolution that ultimately led to ruin. This is the story of the Venezuelan paradox, a rich nation made poor. To understand the sheer scale of Venezuela's transformation, we must first journey back to a time before the black gold, before the boom and the bust that would come to define it. Our story begins in an era when the nation's wealth grew not from beneath the ground, but upon it. This was the age of agriculture. Before the discovery of oil, Venezuela was a quiet, almost forgotten corner of South America. Unlike its neighbors, it lacked the vast silver mines or sprawling empires that had captured the attention of European colonizers for centuries. Its identity was humbler, rooted in the soil and the seasons. From the late 1800s through the early 1920s, it was a modest agricultural country. The nation's economic pulse beat to the rhythm of two key crops, coffee and cacao. On the steep, cool slopes of the Andes, farmers cultivated high-quality coffee beans that were prized in European and American markets. By the turn of the century, coffee alone often accounted for more than half of the country's entire export revenue. Along the warmer coastal regions, Venezuelan cacao, known for its superior quality, was a luxury good sought after by the finest chocolatiers in the world. Together, these two commodities formed the backbone of the economy, the primary link to a world that otherwise paid Venezuela little mind. Life for the vast majority of the population was largely poor and rural. Most Venezuelans lived in small, isolated villages, their lives dictated by the harvest cycles. Cities were few and far between, and the nation's interior was a patchwork of haciendas and undeveloped land, connected by little more than dirt tracks and mule paths. This dependence on coffee and cocoa was both a lifeline and a limitation. The nation's fortunes were tethered to fluctuating global commodity prices, a vulnerability it would never truly escape. Furthermore, its potential was severely constrained by a lack of infrastructure. The rugged Andean topography made transportation a monumental challenge. Getting coffee from the mountainside plantations to the coastal ports for export was a slow, arduous process, relying on mule trains that could take weeks to traverse the difficult terrain. The country had very few railways, and its rivers, while useful, could not create a truly national integrated market. This logistical bottleneck kept the economy localized and capped its growth, reinforcing its status as a quiet agrarian backwater. The political landscape was as rugged and unstable as the geography. Ruled by a succession of regional strongmen known as caudillos, the country was in a near-constant state of turmoil. These military leaders, commanding personal armies, vied for control of the central government in Caracas. Power was seized through force, not democratic process, leading to a century of civil wars and political instability. Yet for all its internal conflict, the country remained economically unassuming on the world stage. Its chronic instability and modest agricultural wealth meant it was largely ignored by the great powers of the day. Then, on December 14, 1922, in the humid, swampy basin surrounding Lake Maracaibo, everything changed. Foreign geologists had been prospecting for years, intrigued by the oil seeps that naturally bubbled to the surface in the region. They had drilled several wells with modest success, but nothing prepared them for what was about to happen. A well named Los Barrazos II, drilled by Shell, was nearing a depth of 500 meters when it hit a zone of immense pressure. It suddenly blew out with unimaginable force. A deafening roar that could be heard for miles. A colossal pillar of black crude oil shot hundreds of feet into the air, shattering the wooden derrick and announcing a new era with terrifying power. It was a cataclysmic event. For 9 straight days, the well spewed an estimated 100,000 barrels of oil from the earth each day. The crude rained down on the surrounding landscape, turning the green marshland into a vast black lake. Workers scrambled desperately, first for their lives, and then to contain the unstoppable torrent. The sheer volume was unlike anything seen before, a raw display of the immense wealth hidden just beneath Venezuela's soil. The news of the Los Barrazos blowout spread like wildfire across the globe. It was the gusher that put Venezuela on the map, confirming the existence of a supergiant oil field. The story was splashed across the front pages of newspapers from New York to London, triggering a frantic rush. Oil companies, wildcatters, and speculators descended on the once sleepy Maracaibo region, transforming it almost overnight into a bustling hub of industrial activity. The great oil discovery had arrived, and with it, Venezuela's fate was irrevocably and forever changed. Within a few short decades, Venezuela was transformed. By the 1950s, it was the richest country in Latin America. Caracas looked like Miami. Oil money created a large middle class, massive imports, and big infrastructure. But it also created a political elite addicted to oil wealth, with no diversification and rampant corruption. In 1958, Venezuela became a democracy. The state created PDVSA, a national oil company, to manage the riches. For decades, oil paid for schools, healthcare, and subsidies. People lived well without producing much. But this was fragile. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, debt exploded, inflation rose, and poverty increased. In 1989, protests were violently crushed. Trust in the system collapsed. Into this void stepped a former soldier, Hugo Chavez. He promised to fight corruption and help the poor. He won democratically in 1998. At first, with oil prices soaring, poverty fell and social programs expanded. But Chavez also took control of courts, attacked private media, and centralized power. Venezuela became dependent on one man and one commodity: oil. The fatal mistake was killing production. Chavez fired thousands of experienced oil engineers and politicized PDVSA. He nationalized farms and factories and imposed price controls. This destroyed food production, industry, and oil efficiency. The country was spending oil money while slowly destroying its ability to earn it. What happens when a nation's engine stalls? For Venezuela, the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013 was not just a political succession. It was the beginning of an economic freefall, a descent so rapid and devastating it would shock the world. The stage was set for a collapse of historic proportions. After Chavez died, his hand-picked successor, Nicolás Maduro, took over. He inherited the immense power Chavez had consolidated, but he lacked his predecessor's charisma and, crucially, the booming oil prices that had fueled the Bolivarian Revolution. Maduro was taking the helm of a ship already taking on water in a storm that was about to break. Then, in 2014, the storm hit. Global oil prices crashed. For a petrostate like Venezuela, whose government budget was entirely dependent on oil revenues of over $100 a barrel, this was a catastrophic blow. The price plummeted by more than half, and with it, the country's primary source of income evaporated almost overnight. This exposed the deep fragility of the Venezuelan economy. The nation had no savings. The boom-era profits had been spent on social programs and consumption, not saved or reinvested. Oil production, crippled by years of mismanagement and lack of investment in PDVSA, had already collapsed, and the country was saddled with enormous foreign debt, taken on during the good times. With no income and no savings, the government made a fateful decision. It printed money to pay its bills. This ignited a toxic feedback loop. The flood of new currency made each bolivar worth less. As prices for goods began to rise, the government had to print even more money to cover costs, which in turn devalued the currency further. This is the deadly spiral of hyperinflation. The numbers became meaningless. Prices could double in a matter of weeks, then days. People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy basic groceries. The government responded with currency redenominations, lopping zeros off the bolivar. First, the Bolivar Fuerte became the Bolivar Soberano, cutting 5 zeros. Then, the Bolivar Digital cut 6 more. But these were cosmetic changes that did nothing to stop the underlying disease. The currency was effectively destroyed. The collapse of the currency led to the collapse of supply chains. It was no longer profitable to produce or import goods. The result was widespread shortages of everything. First, food, then medicine. Hospitals became mere waiting rooms without antibiotics, surgical supplies, or cancer treatments. Faced with hunger, disease, and a future that had vanished, Venezuelans began to flee, triggering the largest migration crisis in modern Latin American history. Over 7 million people, more than 20% of the population, left the country. They walked across borders into Colombia, took perilous journeys through the Amazon, and crossed the treacherous Darien Gap, all in search of a life of basic dignity. It was in this context of an already unfolding humanitarian catastrophe that international sanctions were imposed. Starting in 2017, the US and EU targeted Venezuela's finances and oil sector, aiming to pressure the Maduro government. These sanctions undoubtedly made a desperate situation worse, complicating imports and strangling the government's remaining revenue streams. But it is a crucial historical fact. The collapse began years before the harshest sanctions were enacted. It was born from mismanagement, deep-seated corruption, and the fatal dependency on oil. Today, Venezuela is a fractured, economically broken nation. A de facto dollarization has created a two-tiered society. A small, connected elite and those with access to foreign currency can live a life of relative comfort in bubbles of prosperity. For the vast majority, survival depends on meager state salaries, subsidized food boxes, and increasingly, on remittances, the money sent home by the millions who fled. Politically, the country is frozen. The government maintains its grip on power through control of institutions and suppression of dissent. It is no longer a functioning democracy. A nation that was once the richest and most promising in Latin America now stands as a sobering lesson for the world. A tragic story of how the blessing of immense natural wealth, when mismanaged, can become a nation's greatest and most enduring curse.